Hi everyone! After a few requests to have some graphite tutorials, I thought I would jump in with Batman, this full cat portrait. So I always, as with my other portraits, start off with the eye. Here I'm using a mechanical pencil. It's got a 0.5 HB lead. I buy any leads, to be honest. I'm not any fussy on particular brands. And here I'm using a colour shaper to blend out my layers of graphite. Now, I actually prefer using this colour shaper for blending graphite for the eyes because I think it actually creates a glossy type effect rather than the blending stamps. So that's just my preference, especially for working on the eyes. Now, the graphite pencil set that I'm using is the Derwent Graphite, and they are lovely. Them and the Faber-Castell 9000 series are my two favourite sets. When I'm working on the eye, exactly with any other medium, it's a layering process. So I'll start off usually with a light layer, something like a very light hand, maybe a HB or even lighter 2H, that type of thing, just to get a subtle base layer down, and then building my darker tones from that. Unlike with pastels and acrylics, with graphite you have to work from light to dark because once you've got your darker layers down, it's harder to erase that, and obviously you can't then put your lights as easily on top. So here I'm just using a HB pencil here. What I usually do, this is my preferred way of working in graphite. So I've got a soft tool and I've got some graphite powder, and I'll put that graphite powder down first to give me a base layer. Now, what I do often do is if I've got a bit of sandpaper to the side, I will sand off a little bit maybe of a 6B pencil to give me some darker graphite powder, and I will use that darker shade for some darker areas if it's needed on that base layer. So that's a bit like what I'm doing here because this is the pure black fur. Exactly the same with my soft tools, just so that it gives me a foundation to work against. Now this here is a Tombow Mono eraser. When you've got the layer of graphite powder down first, the Tombow Mono eraser picks up that graphite easily, so you can actually add your highlights in first, which is exactly what I did just below his eye. What I'm starting to do here is add my darker tones, and that's so that I can better judge my mid-tones next to it. So as you can see with the just above his eye, I used the Tombow Mono eraser just to make sure that I picked up that highlight above his eye. You don't want to lose that because, as I said before, once you apply your darker tones of graphite, it can be harder to erase it. So you need to be paying really close attention to where your lights and your darks are, because obviously you don't have a white graphite pencil, obviously, so you can't put white on top. So once you've got this base layer of graphite powder, you can easily judge your darker values. So here I'm using a HB pencil, and then I'll go over with a 2B. Once I've got the darker areas in with a 2B, I'll go up to a 3 or a 4B and I'll work on that. The biggest thing that the tip that I can say is don't go with your darker areas, don't go straight to something like a 6B because you'll create something called graphite. This causes like a shine. So avoid that if you can. It doesn't bother me as such because graphite does have a shine to it. But if you go straight to your darkest pencil first, then you're not going to create as much depth. If you see here, I'm still capturing that fur direction because there's that soft transition between the darker tones and that very subtle mid-tone as the fur curls round and changes direction. So it might not be capturing as clearly on the camera, but you can see there how I layered it. You could see there was a slightly lighter section in the middle. This pencil that I'm using here is the Caran d'Aoche Graphwood, and I think it was the 9B. Use that for my very darkest colours. It is really, really dark. Now this metal tool that you can see me using here is a Helix technical metal erasing shield, and what I've done with that is I've used a bit of Scotch tape across the front side that's closest to you, and then used an embossing tool to take off some of the really lighter, finer details of the fur direction. It picks up the graphite really, really well. Don't do what I did once. I thought I was going to be really clever and I cut a larger section out of the metal stencil. Yeah, don't do that. It doesn't work. It creates too much of a big area. So when you put your embossing tool down into contact with the tape actually then sticks to your paper. Don't do it. It only needs to be that smaller area, which is why this small shield works really, really well. So here it's just, as you say, a layering process. I'm building up from my lights to darks. This there is the Caran d'Ache Graphwood pencil again. This was actually a sample pencil I got from my framers, and I will definitely be getting another one because the dark tones are really dark. So you can see here, that's that bit of metal shield there that I mentioned with the tape. Now you will have to soften out those erasing marks because they are very, they've got very sharp edges. So what I tend to do is, once I've used that template, that metal template, and got some of the graphite off, I'll then use my Tombow mono eraser to create that faded out of the first stroke at the end. You want it to taper off, you don't want it to be a stop-start line. So back to my mechanical pencil now, and that's purely because they keep a nice fine sharp point. So it's really, really good for detail, especially, for these sorts of subtle, smaller areas here. When I'm blending out larger areas of graphite, I definitely do prefer using a soft tool to blend out the layers. That is my preference. So in the middle of the ear there is just a layer of graphite powder, as I've done before. I'll then use my Tombow mono eraser to make sure that I map in where my lighter inner ear hairs are, just like what I'm doing here, and then I'm starting to work around those ears to make sure that I keep that white of those hairs as white as I can. Now what you can do, if you feel it's necessary, is you can actually not put the graphite powder layer down first and you can draw the hairs individually. I don't like working like that. I don't necessarily think it creates as realistic end result. So my preference would be to put the graphite powder down, erase it with a Tombow mono eraser, work around it as I'm doing here, so you can see the basic detailed areas, and you can see now I'm going back in over the top, adding even more detail. It's just my preferred way of working, because you've got to look at it is the hair overlaps, it's in layers, so there will be 50, 60, 70 hairs in that ear. Some of them will be further back and some of them will be much closer to the viewer. So it's about breaking down those layers, drawing what's further back first and then overlapping each layer on top. So once I've done that left side of the face, I then usually block in the other eye, just getting in the basic shape so that I don't lose that. I'm sorry about the lighting, it must have been a really bright day. I did have the blinds across, but hopefully that's not too much of an issue. So once I've got the base areas, the layers in, as you can see, I like to make sure I get an area sort of 80% complete. So that's why I then went ahead and added these longer hairs on top. And this here is the same process as the other. As you can see, I've done exactly the same thing. Now I love working in graphite. It was the very first medium, that and oils was my very first medium that I used years and years ago. And I love graphite now more, if probably, than when I first used it. It is such a good medium to start off with. I think you can learn so much by working just on a grayscale format, black and white. I think you can really create that much more realism, because you're in some respects, especially when you're starting out, because you can focus just on your values, your darks and your lights. You're not having to then focus on what colour's right, because I know I say it in my other videos, but what makes a portrait realistic is your values. If your portrait, you could have the colour spot on compared to your reference photo, but if you don't have your values right and the contrast, the darks need to be dark enough and your lights need to be bright enough, if that's not the case, then it's not going to look as realistic. Even if you've got the colour 100% accurate, it will just look flat. And I break down my portraits into small sections, as you can see. So once I've done the left eye, I did below the cheek, then I went above the eye, did the left ear, and so on. And I think that definitely makes the portrait less daunting. If I was to approach this all in one layer, do one whole layer at the time, then work on to the next bit, I know people do work like that, and that's absolutely fine if it works for you, but I do find that I don't get as much satisfaction. I get very frustrated if I work like that, because I feel like it's not progressing as well or as fast as what you think it is. Like, I like to look at this now and think that this looks like Batman's face. this looks like that cat. Whereas if you just do your base layer and you glance back at your reference photo, I think it can be a bit disheartening because it can take a little while to get past that ugly phase of the base layers. One big tip if you are struggling working with values, knowing how dark to go and how light to go, my biggest tip was turn your reference photo black and white. So just add a grayscale effect. You can get apps on your phone or on your laptop or whatever that will do that for you, and you can therefore draw the values as you see them rather than working with a colour reference photo. Also, the paper that you use will give you slightly different effects. Now, graphite is quite forgiving in that you don't have to be as strict with the paper choice as you do with, for instance, pastels or colour pencil. So it is not so much you have to use this paper because you'll get the other, you'll get the right results. But I like especially this is what I'm using on this paper, is the Strathmore Bristol Vellum. And I think for me it's got just the right amount of tooth. I do prefer a slightly smoother paper with less tooth. It's just how I do not like that gritty grainy look that you can get with more textured papers. So this does still have a tooth to it, but it's smooth enough that doesn't show that grit once you've got your first initial layers down, but still enough tooth that allows you to get your darker colours as dark as what you need. Because that is one common complaint with working with a smoother paper. Your darks can't get as dark because there's not enough tooth to capture that graphite powder. So you can see this is a really small area that I'm working on now. And the biggest tip here is when you're working on small areas is to use really sharp pencils. And I've just put some graphite powder under the chin so that I can then start by adding the details of the bottom lip there that can overlap this where the darker fur is going to be on his chest. Now, I have been getting regular requests to start a Patreon channel. That is something that I am looking into, and it is something that I'm hoping to offer sooner rather than later. So if that is of interest, then don't hesitate to pop any comments below or send me an email via my website. So when I'm working with the chest here, it's very similar, all a layering process. I've put in my darker edge on the left side there, and that's so that I can better judge the values underneath his chin. I thought Batman would be a good one to start off with because he's black and white, and I know a few messages that I've been getting is how do you draw black fur and how do you draw white fur, so I thought this would be a really good one to start with. One of the biggest things to bear in mind when you're drawing white fur is it's never normally white, and when you're looking in black and white, if you was to put a pure white colour next to your reference photo, the white fur that you know is white is not often white. It is usually a lighter version of grey. So bear that in mind, because if you were to draw it pure white, if for instance another part of the portrait which was white, which is usually the reflection in the eye, you'll be then putting the two tones at the same value, whereas in reality the white fur is actually a very subtle shade of light grey compared to the bright white highlight in the eye. Like I say, not always, but most of the time that is the case. Now what I'm using here is just a little paintbrush, and it's just so that I can soften out that graphite even more. It's a really light hand, but you won't notice those sorts of blending differences on the videos, I don't think, but it just softens out that even more. And that's because, bearing in mind, you've got to try and not only capture the fur direction, the tone, the depth, lights, your lights and your darks, but you need to make sure that you replicate the texture. So the chest fur here was much softer in appearance compared to the fur on his face. Now the way that you achieve that is by blending. So you can see what I'm using here. I'm using my Tombow Mono eraser. I erased the areas that I want, and then I blended it and softened it with my either that paintbrush, the green handled paintbrush, or my soft tool. And that's so that you then you push those details that you've just made with the Tombow Mono eraser a bit further back, so you soften everything out as you do it. And by blending them out like that, that is how you will achieve that softer look. So you can still see that you can see the fur direction and the differences where you've got some shadow where the fur is in clumps and clusters, but by softening it out you are then pushing that detail a little bit further back and softening everything. I've got a black Labrador in graphite that I'll be able to share with you hopefully next week, so that will be another graphite tutorial that I'll do, and that will make for a nice tutorial because a black Labrador and she had a really shiny coat, so it was all about capturing that contrast, getting your lights in the right place and light enough, and your shadows in the right place and making sure they're dark enough. So I'll make sure that I'll upload a voiceover for that one as well. If this video is of use, I would appreciate if you give it a thumbs up, it really does help. And if you're interested in future content, hit the subscribe button in the bottom corner there and hit the bell button so that you get notified of new content. I upload voiceovers every Tuesday and Saturday at 6 PM. So I'm sorry about the bright light here, it's a bit overexposed, but I'm doing the same thing. I'm adding the graphite powder in, and what I'm done here, there's graphite powder which you can buy online, which is usually lighter, which is what you've got in the area above this area that I'm working now. The area that I'm working on now, I used the 6B graphite that I sanded down myself, and that's so that I can capture this shadowed area as the fur changes direction as his body is curved round slightly. And from my other videos you'll see that I always mentioned that the base layers are really important, and that's also the case in graphite. If I was to apply one whole solid layer of the same graphite tone, you don't create that effect, that realism as much. I think once you map in where your darker tones are and your lighter tones are with the graphite powder, I think you can better judge the fur direction. Exactly like what I'm doing here, you can see I curved the soft tool round where the fur direction changes. So paying really close attention to your reference photo during these base layer sections is really, really important. So I'm using a mixture of HB, 2B and 4B, and then I used my mechanical pencil as well for some of the sharper details on this part because this was capturing more of the light. And something that will make your portrait more realistic is making sure, like these white hairs that overlap the darker sections, that you make sure that it's not just a sharp line. You want to make sure that you use your Tombow Mono eraser or the razor of your choice and drag those whiter fur strokes over the darker area. So Batman here was sat on a fence post, so as this section starts working on the legs and the lower part of the body, pay really close attention to where the fur changes direction. If you draw the fur in a different direction, you will not get that structure of that animal right. So pay really close attention to that, because obviously his pose in this photo is going to make that fur direction swap, change in completely various random directions. So just make sure you follow your reference photo really closely. And obviously the last thing that you would do on a portrait is your whiskers. If you've got the head and the neck completed at this stage, it was done, you'd be absolutely fine to add your whiskers in beforehand. You haven't got to obviously work on the body before you do that, but don't add your whiskers in before you've finished the chest, because then you'll have to work around the whiskers and that's just a little bit of a nightmare. And I know obviously some other artists do use an embossing tool to put the whiskers in and that sort of thing, but I really do not like how it creates that indented look. I don't like the thought of damaging the paper like that, so it's more than easy if you use the graphite powder as a base layer that you can put your whiskers in quite easily afterwards, especially with a Tombow Mono eraser. That is definitely my preferred eraser for details like that. I hope this video was of use. Don't hesitate to pop any comments below of any future content you want me to make. If there's any topics that you want me to cover, pop it in the comments below and I'll add it to my list for future voiceovers. So thank you for watching. As I say, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe, and I'll next be uploading the voiceover on Tuesday. Bye!